Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial. So today what I'm going to be showing you is how you can get form data that has been submitted to one of your endpoints in Node.js with and without a file attachment. Now, how you handle form submission on the back end depends on the encoding of the form data as it is sent by the front end. So there are two types of encoding when sending a form. The first one is that you can send it as a string, as a URL encoded string. So this is what you would use if there is no file attachment. If there is a file attachment, then you need to use multipart form data because this supports not just text, but also raw binary data. Now, if you want to, you can send form data every single time as multipart form data, and it will work, but it isn't the most efficient solution because with multipart form data, there are separators and metadata about each bit of content, which if form data doesn't contain a file are unnecessary. So if you want to be efficient, you should use this encoding type. If the form data does not contain a file, and if it does have a file attachment, you should send it as multipart form data. And I'll show you what the payload looks like in both of these cases when I do submit the form from the front end. So your options for that are either relying upon the default HTML form submission behavior or submit it using JavaScript. So if you want to do it without writing any JavaScript in HTML, you can add some attributes to your form, the endpoint, the encoding type, which we discussed, and also the method. So for the endpoint that we're sending the data to on the server side, this is coded as a post endpoint. So therefore, I set the post method in the HTML to type post. So you can send form data to the backend like this, and it will work. But there are a number of advantages to sending it with JavaScript instead. For example, you can handle a success or failure of the post without a page refresh. You can also add validation to the form that is beyond what you can do in HTML alone. Add extra items to the payload that are not included in the form, and you can even track the upload progress of the form and use that to update a progress bar, something like that. So in JavaScript, you have much more control over how a form is submitted, and therefore that is what I usually use and will also be using here. So here in JavaScript, I've already selected the form and added an event listener to it, listening out for a submit event. So this fires when a user clicks on a button in the form or type submit. When that occurs, the first thing I'm doing is calling the prevent default method on the event object that is produced automatically. So that prevents HTML handling the form submission because we want to do it here with JavaScript. So we'll create payloads of both type here, a string that is URL encoded and multipart form data. So we'll start with multipart form data because from that we can create a URL encoded string. So it's quite straightforward to create the multipart form data payload in JavaScript. You can use the form data constructor using the new operator before it to create a new object of its type, and a trick to get all of the form data into that form data object, which is the payload, is to pass the form element into the form data constructor. And this is now the payload of type multipart form data that we can send to the server. Now, if you do it this way, the form data constructor, it always creates a payload of type multipart form data, even if a form does not contain a file. But you can easily convert a form data payload to a URL encoded string using another constructor. So in this case, it's the URL search params constructor, and you simply pass form data payload into it, and then to convert it to a URL encoded string. So to print it in the payload format, you call toString on it, and then if you save the return value, that is now your payload. So I'll save that under a reference of URL encoded. So to send the data, I'm going to be using fetch, and the endpoint is going to be localhost port 3000 /upload, because that is the post route that I have defined here in my app. And to make it a fetch post request, you specify in an options object in the second argument position that method should be of type post, and then the payload you place into a body property also on that object. And finally, you want to add a content type header to the request so that the server knows that the data on the body of the request is form data that is URL encoded, and it can start parsing it appropriately. So to set some headers, it's another property on the options object, and you set the name and the value of each header in string format. So in this case, we want to add a content type header, and the MIME type should be the value. That's this value that we have here already. Now, because we're posting to the server using JavaScript, I'm going to delete the attributes that I added to the form element because these are no longer necessary. And I'm also going to comment out the file input here because we're starting with URL encoded format that doesn't support file data. So I'll bring this back when we're sending the data as multipart form data. Now let's configure the server to receive form data that is URL encoded. So before this tutorial, I already installed Express and the middleware package for Express cores into my project folder, and I'm setting cores as middleware here that applies to all routes, and what that is doing is allowing requests from any IP address so I don't get any cause error when testing. So with this boilerplate code, if you try accessing the body on the incoming request, you might think that you will get access to the payload, but what you actually get is a value of undefined. So I'll show you that in action here. I'll send the request. So we are getting undefined log to the console, and the reason is that you first have to configure Node to be able to pass this kind of data on the body of a request. So previously, to do this, you would have to install a third-party library. The popular one was body parser, but now that functionality is available natively in Express. So to enable the parsing of URL encoded data on all routes in your app, you call app.use, and then inside there, you call express URL encoded, and then you have to pass in as an argument an object. Property that you must set here is extended, and give that a value of true or false. So this refers to the complexity of the algorithm that will decode the URL encoded string. If you set it to true, then it's going to use a more complex algorithm that can handle nested data in the URL encoded string. If you set it to false, then it's going to use a simpler algorithm. But here, in both cases, we don't have any nested data, so we can set that to either true or false, and we're going to get the same result. Now, another couple of options that can be useful in practice here are, first of all, a limit, which sets an upper limit for the payload in bytes. So by default, this is 100 kilobytes, but for a form with only 2 input fields, that seems a bit on the high side. So I'll set a custom limit of 10,000 bytes. Another property that can be really useful is parameter limit. So here you're setting the number of items that you will accept on the URL encoded string. So we have 2 inputs, so we don't want to accept a payload that has more than 2 items on it. So we've configured Express to be able to pass incoming URL encoded data on any route. So if I try to send the form data again to the upload route, the data should now be available on the body property of the request. So to do that, I'm going to restart the server first and then send the data, and we can see what type of data we've sent by going to the network tab and clicking on the request. So I'm just going to zoom out a bit here so you can see it. If we view the source, this is the URL encoded string with the name of the first form item, followed by the value, and then the name of the second followed by its value. So this is a very compact and efficient payload, and that's the reason why it's preferable to send text data as a URL encoded string over a multipart form data object, which we'll be seeing in a moment. Now in the headers, you see that we've got our content type header added here, and on the server side, we are now not getting undefined like we did before. What we're getting is the data in object format. This bit of notation before it just means that the object doesn't have a prototype, so you can't call any methods on the object. So you can think about it as kind of like a pure data object. Now, if you want, you can set up parsing to occur on specific routes rather than on all routes. So to prevent this applying to all routes, I won't call express URL encoded inside app.use anymore. I'll instead store the return value in a new variable and pass that in as middleware for this specific post route. Now, when I restart the server, I should get the same result, but now I'm just applying the parsing to this route specifically. So if I did have another route and I didn't pass in the middle reference as middleware, then it would return undefined. So one reason that you might want to apply the parsing to individual routes is if you want different options to apply to different routes, then you could create a different reference for each set of options and pass in the appropriate one to each route. Okay, so this covers form data that is URL encoded. Now let's cover a case where the form data has a file attachment. So in this case, on the front end, instead of sending URL encoded as the payload, you send the form data object directly. So you actually don't need to set any headers in this case. Form data is going to set the header for you to multipart form data. Now up in the form, before I commented out the file input, so let's bring this back now. So we're now sending multipart form data from the front end that includes a file, but the app isn't yet set up to handle form data of type multipart form data. So for this, you do need to rely on a third-party library, which I installed before recording this tutorial. So the name of the library is Malta. You can install it from the command line when in your project folder with npm i Malta. And I'm going to start with a very basic setup where I save whatever file is on the request to a folder called uploads. So to start using Malta with basic configuration settings, you call the library, passing in an object with a dest property, and the value of this is where you want any file data to be stored. So I'm going to specify that I want the data to be stored in a folder called files. Now, I haven't actually created a files folder yet. Malta is going to do this for me if you are using basic configuration settings like we are here. Now, the next step is to store a reference to these settings and use that as middleware on a route where you want to accept multipart form data. Now, when passing in a Malta object as middleware, you need to call a method on it that corresponds to whether it is a single or multiple files. So for a single file, you call the single method, passing into it the name of the item on the form as it is on the front end. So here it has the name of file. So in this case, I would pass in this name to the single method. Now for multiple files, you call the any method, and for this you don't need to enter any kind of argument here. So I'm going to be using this because it's a good catch-all method. It works for both single and multiple file uploads. So any text input data on the form is going to be made available on the body property of the request. Data about the uploaded file or files is going to be available on the files property. If you called any here, if you called single, then it's going to be available on the file property, and the file data itself will be stored in the folder that you specify in your configuration settings. So I'll save this now and restart the server. And from the front end, send some form data with a file attached. So this time, of course, selecting a file, and I send that to the back end. So let's take a look at the payload that we sent during the source here. So you can see here that the payload is much more complex than it was for a URL encoded string. There is metadata for each item in the form and also separators between each item. So the text data is represented here. The file data, you can't see it in this representation, but this is sent as it is in raw binary format. Now, given the complexity of the payload here, you can see why it's preferable from an efficiency perspective to send a URL encoded string if the form data doesn't include a file. But if it does contain a file, like it does in this instance, then you need a payload of this type. So now let's see what's being logged on the server side. So we're getting back the text input from the form in an object again, just like we were before, and we're getting some metadata about the file. And if we take a look at the project folder, Malta has created a new files folder, and inside there is the file data saved under a randomly generated file name. Now, if you want to be more specific in terms of how you process the file, for example, giving it a custom file name or limiting the size of the file that can be uploaded, then you're going to need to set some additional settings when you're configuring Malta. Now, rather than typing this out, because it's quite a lot of code, I'm going to copy some code that I created before this tutorial with some custom settings. So it is quite a lot more code, but the process is very similar to what we were doing earlier. So now instead of setting a dest property when I'm calling Malta, I'm setting some custom storage settings, which I defined above here. So to create a custom storage object with Malta, you call malta.distStorage, and then you define properties on this object. So for the destination, I'm setting this to the current working directory /files. A little gotcha here is that the folder does have to exist if you're using these custom settings. So Malta won't create a folder for you like it did when we were using the basic configuration. Now for the file name, I'm creating a new value. So it's starting with file underscore, and then I'm inserting into the string a UUID. So that is a randomly generated identifier. And you can use this method if you're using a very recent version of Node, because this is a fairly new feature. If you find that this isn't available to you natively, you can get the same result by importing the UUID library from npm and using that instead. Now, something to note here is that you can write all kinds of logic before you pass your constructed file name into the callback function. So my logic is just on this one line. If you want to write your own logic, you can write something more complex here, and you have available to you the request object and also the file data. So if you want to work with the original file name to store on the server, then you have that available to you on file.originalName. So I'm just going to log that to the console, but you could use that in constructing your file name if you want to. Now, another important setting that you may want to optionally specify on the main Malta object is an upper limit on the size of the file that can be uploaded. So this is specified in bytes here, equating to around 1 megabyte. So if you do want to set an upper size limit, then you do that like I am here. So let's test this now. I'll start the server again, and then on the front end, send the form again with the file attached. And then we'll take a look at what's been logged in the console. So it's very similar to last time. We have metadata for the file, the text input in an object. You see also that the logging of the original file name was successful. So you could use that to set the file name if you want, but that's not what I did here. I created a file name file underscore followed by a random UUID, and you can see here that that has worked as expected. Now finally, just to check that the limiter is working, I'll set the upper size file limit to 1 byte, restart the server, and then submit the form again. So this time we're getting an error status code 500, and if we take a look in the terminal, we get the error printed there file was too large. So the upper limit on the file size is definitely working. Now, if you want, you can apply both bits of middleware that we've seen in this tutorial to a single root. So to do that, you just need to make sure that both bits of middleware apply to the root. So I can pass in middle and upload any here. And now if form data comes in that is URL encoded and has the appropriate header, then it's going to be dealt with by the URL encoded middleware. And if it's multi-part form data with that header, then it's going to be dealt with by the multi middleware. So that is it for this tutorial on receiving form data in Node.js. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please consider hitting the like button down below this video. It helps us with the algorithm and others to find this video. And if you'd like to see more content like this from us in the future, don't forget you can subscribe to the channel.